He studied scientific truths, then became upset even more by the apparent causes of their temporal condition. It looked as though the time spans of scientific truths are in inverse function of the intensity of scientific effort. Thus, the scientific truth of the 20th century seems to have a much shorter lifespan than those of the last century, because scientific activity is now much greater. If, in the next century, scientific activity increases tenfold, then the life expectancy of scientific truth can be expected to drop to perhaps 1/10, as long as it is now. What shortens the lifespan of the existing truth is the volume of hypothesis offered to replace it. The more the hypothesis, the shorter the time span of the truth. And what seems to be causing the number of hypotheses to grow in recent decades seems to be nothing other than the scientific method itself. The more you look, the more you see. Instead of selecting one truth from a multitude, you are increasing the multitude. What this means logically is that you try to move towards unchanging truth through the application of scientific method. You actually do not move towards it at all. You move away from it. It is your application of the scientific method that is causing it to change, the truth to change. How can you be moving further away from the truth, though? What Faraday observed on a personal level was the phenomenon profoundly characteristic of the history of science, which has been swept under the carpet for years. The predictable results of the scientific inquiry and the actual results of the scientific inquiry are diametrically opposed here, and no one seems to pay too much attention to the fact. The purpose of the scientific method, the predicted results of the scientific inquiry, and the actual results are diametrically opposed. The purpose of the scientific method is to select a single truth from among many hypothetical truths. That more than anything else is what science is all about. But historical science has done exactly the opposite. Through multiplication upon multiplication of facts, information, theories, and hypotheses, it is science itself that is leading mankind from single absolute truths to multiple, indeterminate, relative ones. The major producer of the social chaos, the indeterminacy of thought and values that rational knowledge is supposed to eliminate, is none other than science itself. And what Faraday saw in the isolation of his own laboratory work years ago is now seen everywhere in the technological world today. Scientifically produced anti-science chaos. It's possible now to look back a little and see why it's important to talk about this person in relation to everything that's been said before concerning the divisions between classic and romantic realities and the irreconcilability of the two, classic and romantic realities. Unlike the multitude of romantics who are disturbed about the chaotic changes science and technology forces upon the human spirit, Faraday, with his scientifically trained mind, was able to do more than just wringing his hands with dismay, or run away, or condemn the whole situation broadside without offering any solution. Good, I'm glad he's coming up with a solution. As I said, he did in the end offer a number of solutions, but the problem was so deep and so formidable and complex that no one really understood the gravity of what he was resolving, and so failed to understand or misunderstood what he said. The cause of our current social crisis, and he's talking social crisis. What year is this? 60s, 70s? This edition was published in 2005. It is copyright 1974. So he's talking 74 chaoticness as compared to today. It's possible. Solutions. As I said, he did in the end offer numerous solutions, but the problem was so deep and formidable. Okay, the cause of our current social crisis, he would have said, is a genetic defect within the nature of reason itself, and until the genetic defect is cleared, the crisis will continue. Our current models of rationality are not moving society forward into a better world. They are taking it further and further from that better world. Since the Renaissance, these modes have worked. As long as the need for food, clothing, and shelter is dominant, they will continue to work. But now that, for huge masses of people, these needs no longer overwhelm anything else, the whole structure of reason handed down to us from ancient times is no longer adequate. It begins to be seen for what it really is: emotional, hollow, aesthetic, meaningless, spiritually empty. And now, for the huge mass of the people, these needs no longer overwhelm everything else. The basic needs of society no longer overwhelm basic needs of a person. But now that, for huge masses, they no longer overwhelm everything else, the whole structure of reason handed down to us from ancient times is no longer adequate. I don't understand if he's on to something here or this is not true. It begins to be seen for what it really is: emotionally hollow. That today is where it all is at. I will continue to be at for a long time to come. And will continue to be at for a long time to come. I have a vision of angry, continuing social crisis that no one really understands the depth of, let alone the solutions to. I've seen people like John and Sylvia living lost and alienated from the whole rational structure of civilized life, looking for solutions outside that structure, finding none that are really satisfactory for one. And then I have a vision of Faraday and his lone, isolated abstractions in the laboratory. Actually concerned with the same crisis, but starting from the other point, moving in the opposite direction. And what I'm trying to do here is to pull it all together. It's so big, and that's why I seem to wonder sometimes. No one that Faraday talked to seemed really concerned about this phenomenon that so baffled him. They seemed to say, we know scientific method is valid, so we asked about it. So why ask about it? Okay. So it's valid, we understand that. I've never asked about it. Why would we ask about it? Faraday didn't understand this attitude, didn't know what to do about it. And because he wasn't a student of science for personal or utilitarian reasons, it just stopped him completely. It was as if he were contemplating that serene mountain landscape Einstein had described. Suddenly, between the mountains had appeared his fissure, a gap of pure nothing. And slowly and agonizingly, to explain this gap, he had to admit that the mountains, which had seemed built for eternity, might possibly be nothing else, perhaps just figments of his own imagination. It stopped him. And slowly, agonizingly, to explain this gap, he had to admit that the mountains, which had seemed built for eternity, might possibly be something else. So Ferris, who at the age of 15 had finished his freshman year of science, was at the age of 17 expelled from the university for failing grades, and immaturity and inattention to studies were given as official cause. There was nothing anyone could have done about it, either to prevent it or correct it. The university couldn't have kept him on without abandoning standards completely. In a stunned state, Ferris began a long series of lateral drifts that led him into a far orbit of mind that he eventually returned. Along a route we are now following to the doors of the university itself. Tomorrow I'll try to start on that route. At Laurel, in sight of the mountains at last, we stop for the night. The evening breeze is cool now, and it comes down off the snow. Although the sun must have disappeared behind the mountains an hour ago, there's still good light in the sky from behind the range. Sylvia and John and Chris and I walk up to a long main street in the gathering dusk and feel the presence of the mountains. Even though we talk about other things, I feel happy to be there and still a little sad to be here too. Sometimes it is a little better to travel than to arrive. Chapter 11, page 117. I wake up wondering if I know we're near mountains because of memory or because of something in the air. We're in a beautiful old wooden room of a hotel. The sun is shining on the dark wood through the window shade, but even with the shade drawn, I can sense that we're near mountains. There's mountain air in this room. It's cool and moist and almost fragrant. One deep breath makes me ready for the next one, and then the next. And with each deep breath, I feel a little readier until I jump out of bed and pull up the shade. And I let all the sunlight in, brilliant, cool, bright, sharp, and clear. An urge grows to go over and push Chris up and down, to bounce him awake to see all of this. But out of kindness or respect, maybe, he is allowed to sleep a while longer, so with the razor and soap, I go to the common washroom at the other end of the long corridor of the same dark wood, floorboards creaking all the way. In the washroom, the hot water is steaming and perking in the pipes, too hot at first for shaving, but fine after I mix it. Through the window beyond the mirror, I see there is a porch, out and back. And when done, go out and stand on it. It's at a level with the tops of the trees surrounding the hotel, which seems to respond to this morning air the same way I do. Branches and leaves move with each light breeze as if it were expected. Were what had been waiting for what they were waiting for the whole time. Chris is soon up and Sylvia comes out of her room saying she and John have already eaten breakfast and he is out walking somewhere. So she will go with Chris and me and walk down with us to breakfast. We are in love with everything this morning and talk about good things all the way down in the sunlit morning street to a restaurant. The eggs and hot cakes and coffee are from heaven. Sylvia and Chris talk immediately about his school and friends and personal things while I listen and gaze through the large restaurant windows of the storefront across the road. So different now from the lonely night in South Dakota. Beyond those buildings are mountains and snowfields. Sylvia says John has talked to someone in town about another route to Bozeman, south through Yellowstone Park. South, I say. You mean Red Lodge? I guess so. A memory comes to me of snowflakes in June. That road goes way up above the timberline. Is that bad, Sylvia asks. It'll be cold. In the middle of the snowfields, in my mind appear the cycles of us riding on them, but just tremendous. We meet John again, and it is settled. Soon beyond a railroad underpass, we are on a twisting blacktop through fields towards the mountains up ahead. This is a road Ferris used all the time, and flashes of his memory coincide everywhere. The high, dark Absaroka Range looms directly ahead. We are following a creek to its source. It contains water that was probably snow less than an hour ago. The stream and the road pass through the green and stony fields, each a little higher than before. Everything is so intense in this sunlight. Dark shadows, bright lights, dark blue sky. The sun is bright and hot, and we're all in it. But when we pass under trees along the road, it's suddenly cold. We play tag with a little blue Porsche along the way, passing it with a beep and being passed by it with a beep, and doing this several times through fields of dark aspens and bright greens of grass and mountain shrubs. All this is remembered. He would use this route to get into the high country and then backpack in from the road for 3 or 4 days or 5 days, and then come back out for more food and head back up again, meeting these mountains in an almost psychological way. The train of his abstractions becomes so long and so involved, he had to have the surrounding of silence and space here to hold it all straight. It was as though hours of construction would have been shattered by the least distraction of other thought or other duty. It wasn't like other people's thinking. Even then, before his insanity, it was at a level at which everything shifts and changes, at which institutional values and verities are gone, and there is nothing but one's own spirit to keep one going. His early failure had released him from any felt obligation to think along institutional lines, and his thoughts were already independent to a degree few people are familiar with. He felt that institutions such as schools, churches, governments, and political organizations of all sorts all tend to direct thought for ends rather than truth, for the perpetuation of those, and for the control of the individuals in the service of these functions. Perpetual? He came to see his early failures as a lucky break, an accidental escape from the trap that had been set for him. And he was very trap-wary about institutional truths for the remainder of his time. Trap-wary. He didn't see these things and think this way at first. However, later on, I'm getting However, only later on. He didn't see these things and think this way at first, however, only later on. I'm getting way out of sequence here. This all came much later. At first, the truths of Faraday's began to pursue where lateral truths, no longer the frontal truths of science, those towards which the discipline pointed, but the kind of truths you see laterally out of the corner of your eye. In a laboratory situation, when your whole procedure goes haywire, when everything goes wrong or is indeterminate or is so screwed up by unexpected results, you can't make heads or tails out of anything. And you start looking laterally. That's the word he later uses to describe growth of knowledge that doesn't move forward like an arrow in flight, but expands sideways like an arrow enlarging in flight. Or like the archer discovering that although he has hit the bullseye and won the prize, his head is on a pillow and the sun is coming in the window. That didn't make sense to me. Lateral knowledge is knowledge that from a wholly unexpected direction, from a direction that's not even understood as a direction until the knowledge forces itself on one. Lateral truths point to the falseness of axioms and postulates underlying one's existing system of getting at the truth. To all appearances, he is just drifting. In actuality, he is just drifting. Drifting is what one does when looking at lateral truth. He couldn't follow any known method or procedure to uncover its cause because it was these methods and procedures that were all screwed up in the first place. So he drifted, and that was all he could do. The drift took him into the army, which sent him to Korea. From his memory, there's a fragment, a picture on a wall, seen from the prow of a ship, shining radiant, like a gate of heaven across a misty harbor. He must have valued that fragment greatly and thought about it many times, because although it doesn't fit anything else, it is intense, so intense. I've turned to it myself many times. It seems to symbolize something very important, a turning point. Like a gate of heaven across the misty harbor, he must have valued the fragment greatly. Memory. There's a fragment, a picture on a wall, seen from the prow of a ship. Picture of a wall, seen from the prow of a ship. I've returned to it myself many times. It seems to symbolize something very important, a turning point. His letters from Korea are radically different from his earlier writing, indicating this same turning point. They just explode with emotion. He writes page after page about tiny details of things he sees: marketplaces, shops with sliding glass doors, slate roofs, roads, thatched huts, everything. Sometimes full of wild enthusiasm, sometimes depressed, sometimes angry, sometimes humorous. He is like someone or some creature that has found an exit from a cage and he did not even know was around him. He had exited this cage they didn't even know was around him, and wildly roaming over the countryside, visually devouring everything in sight. Later, he made friends with Korean laborers who spoke some English but wanted to learn more so they could qualify as translators. He spent time with them after working hours, and in return they took him on long weekend hikes through the hills to see their homes and friends and translate for him the way of life and thoughts of another culture. He is sitting by a footpath on a beautiful windswept hillside overlooking the Yellow Sea. The rice in the terrace below the footpath is full grown and brown. His friends look down at the sea with him, seeing islands far out from shore. They eat a picnic lunch and talk to one another and to him. And the subject is ideographs and the relation to the world. He comments on how amazing it is that everything in the universe can be described by the 26 written characters with which they have been working. His friends nod and smile and eat the food they've been taken from tins and say no pleasantly. His friends nod and smile and eat the food they've taken from tins and say no pleasantly. He is confused by the nod yes and then the answer no, and so he repeats the statement. Again comes the nod, meaning yes, and the answer no. That is the end of the fragment. But like the wall, it's one he thinks about many times. The final strong fragment from that part of the world is of a compartment of a troop ship. He is on his way home. The compartment is empty and unused. He is alone on the bunk made of canvas laced to a steel frame like a trampoline. There are 5 of these, to a tier after tier of them, completely filling the empty troop compartment. This is the foremost compartment of the ship, and the canvas in the adjoining frames rises and falls, accompanied by the elevator feelings in his stomach. He contemplates these things and a deep booming on the steel plates all around him and realizes that except for these signs, there is no indication whatsoever that the entire compartment is rising massively high up into the air and then plunging down over and over. He wonders if it is that which is making it difficult to concentrate on the book before him, but realizes no, the book is just hard. It's a text on original philosophy, and it's the most difficult book he's ever read. He's glad to be alone and bored on this empty troop compartment. Otherwise, he'd never get through it. The book states that there's a theoretical component of man's existence, which is primarily Western, and the book states that there's a theoretical component of man's existence, which is primarily Western, and this corresponds to Phaedrus, laboratory past, and an aesthetic component of a man's existence, which is seen more strongly in the Orient, and this corresponded to Phaedrus' Korean past, and that these never seem to meet. These terms, theory, the terms theoretic, and aesthetic correspond to what Phaedrus later called classical and romantic modes of reality, and probably shaped these terms in his mind more than he ever knew. Theoretical, aesthetic. But it has its own ethics. Okay, the difference is that the classic, Phaedrus later called classic romantic modes of reality and probably shaped these terms in his mind more than he ever knew. The difference is that the classical reality of primary theories, theoretic, but has its own aesthetics too. The romantic reality is primary aesthetic, but has its theory too. The theoretic and aesthetic ethic split is between components of a single world. The classic and the romantic split is between two separate worlds. The philosophy book, which is called The Meeting of the East and West by F.S.C. Northrop, suggests that greater cognizance be made of the undifferentiated aesthetics continuum from which the theoretic arises. I'm getting tired. The classic and romantic split in between two separate worlds. The philosophy book, which is called The Meeting of the East and West by Mr. Northrop, suggests the greater cognizance be made of the undifferentiated aesthetic continuum from which theoretics arise. Fairdrass didn't understand this, but after arriving in Seattle and his discharge from the Army, he sat in his hotel room for 2 whole weeks eating enormous Washington apples and thinking and eating and more apples and thinking some more. And then as a result of all these fragments and thinking, he returned to the university to study philosophy. His lateral drift was ended. He was actively in pursuit of something now. What was he pursuing? A sudden cross gust of cold air comes heavy with a smell of pines, and soon another and another, and as we approach the Red Lodge, I am shivering. At the Red Lodge, the road almost joined to the base of the mountain. The dark, ominous mass beyond dominates even the roofs of the buildings on either side in the main street, and we park the cycles and unpack them to remove the warm clothing. We walk past the ski shops into a restaurant where we see the walls huge photographs of the route we will be taking up. And up and up and up over one of the highest paved roads in the world. I feel some anxiety about this, which I realize is irrational, and try to get rid of it by talking about the road to the others. There is no way to fall off, no danger to the motorcycle, just a memory of a place where you could throw a stone and it would drop thousands of feet before coming to rest, somehow associating that stone with the cycle and the rider. When coffee is finished, we put on the heavy clothing and repack, and have soon traveled to the first of many switchbacks. Turns across the face of the mountain. The asphalt of the road is much wider and safer than it occurred in memory. On a cycle, you have all sorts of extra room. John and Sylvia take the hairpin turns ahead and then come back above us, facing us and having smiles. Soon we take the turn and see their backs again, and then another turn for them, and we meet them again, laughing. It's so hard when contemplated in advance, and so easy when you do it. That's probably a lot of life, when we worry about things. Worry about a lot of stuff. It seems so hard. It's easy when you do it. I talked about Faraday's lateral drifting, which ended with entry into the discipline of philosophy. He saw philosophy as the highest echelon of the entire hierarchy of knowledge. Among the philosophers, this is so widely believed it's almost a platitude. But for him, it's a revelation. He discovered that science he'd once thought of as a whole world of knowledge is only a branch of philosophy, which is far broader and far more general. The questions he had asked about Infinite hypotheses hadn't been of interest to science because they weren't scientific questions. Science cannot study scientific method without getting into a bootstraps problem. It destroys the validity of its answers. The question he'd asked were at higher level than science goes, and so Faraday found in philosophy a natural continuation of the question that brought him to science in the first place. What does it all mean? What's the purpose of all of this? At a turnout on the road, we stop and take some record photographs to show we have been here, and then walk to a little path that takes us out to the edge of a cliff. A motorcycle on the road, almost straight down beneath us, could hardly be seen from up here. We bundle up more tightly against the cold and continue upward, onward and upward. The broad-leaf trees are all gone. Only small pines are left, and many of these have twisted and stunted shapes. Soon, stunted pines disappear entirely, and we are in the alpine meadows. There's not a tree anywhere. Only grass everywhere, filled with little pink and blue and white dots of intense color, wildflowers everywhere. These and grasses and moss and lichens are all that can live here now. We've reached high country, above the timberline. I look over my shoulder for one last view of the gorge, like looking down at the bottom of the ocean. People spend their entire lives at those lower altitudes without any awareness of this higher country existing. The road turns inward and away from the gorge and into snowfield. The engine backfires fiercely from lack of oxygen. And threatens to stop, but never does. Soon, we are between banks of old snow, the way snow looks in earlier spring after a thaw, and little streams of water run everywhere, into the moss and mud, and then below into this weak old grass, and then small wildflowers and tiny pink, blue, yellow, white ones, which seem to pop out, sun brilliant, from black shadows everywhere. It's like this. Little pins of colored light shoot forth to me from a background of somber dark green and black. Dark sky now and cold, except where the sun hits. On the sun side of my arm and leg and jacket are hot, but the dark side and the deep shadows now are very cold. The snowfields become heavy and show steep banks where snowplows have been. The banks become 4 feet high and then 6 feet high. Then 12 feet high, and we move through twin walls, almost a tunnel of snow. And then the tunnel opens into a dark sky again, and when we emerge, we see we're at the summit. Beyond is another country. Mountains, lakes, pines, snowfields are below. Above and beyond beyond them, as far as we can see, are further mountain ranges covered with snow, the high country. We stop and park at a turnoff where a number of tourists take pictures and look around at the view and at one another, and then back on his cycle, John removes his camera from his saddlebag. From my own machine, I remove the toolkit and spread it out on the seat, and then I take a screwdriver and start the engine with the screwdriver, adjusting the carburetor until the idling sound changes from a really bad whopping to just slightly bad. I'm surprised at how all the way up it backfired. I'm surprised at how all the way up it backfired and sputtered and kicked and gave every indication it was going to quit, but it never did. I didn't adjust them out of curiosity to see what 11,000 feet of altitude would do. Now I'm leaving them rich and sounds just as bad because we'll be going down some now towards Yellowstone Park, and if they aren't slightly rich now, they'll get too lean later on, which is dangerous because it overheats the engine. Though backfiring is still fairly heavy on the way down from the summit, the engine drags in second gear, but then the noise diminishes as we reach lower altitudes. The forest returns and we move among the rocks and lakes and trees, and now, taking beautiful turns and curves of the road. I want to talk about another kind of high country now, in the world of thought, which is in some ways, for me at least, seems to parallel or produce feelings similar to this, and call it the high country of the mind. If all human knowledge, everything is known, is believed to be an enormous hierarchy structure, then the high country of the mind is found at the uppermost reaches of the structure, in the most general, the most abstract considerations of all. Few people travel there. There's no real profit to be made from wandering through it. Yet, like this high country of the material world all around us, it has its own austere beauty that to some people make the hardships of traveling through it seem worthwhile. In the high country of the mind, one has to become adjusted to a thinner air of uncertainty, and to the enormous magnitude of the questions asked, and to the answers proposed to these questions. The sweep goes on and on and on, so obviously much further than the mind can grasp. One hesitates even to go near the fear of getting lost in them and never finding one's way out. But what is the truth and how to do you know it when you have it? What is the truth and how do you know it when you have it? How do we really know anything? Is there an I, a soul, which knows? Or is the soul merely cells coordinating senses? Is reality basically changing, or is it fixed and permanent? When it's said that something means something, what's meant by that? Many trails through these high ranges have been made and forgotten since the beginning of time, and although the answers brought back from these trails have claimed permanence and universality for themselves, civilizations have varied on the trails that they have chosen, and we have many different answers to the same questions, all of which can be thought as true within their own context. Even within a single civilization, old trails are constantly closed and new ones opened up. We sometimes argue that there's no real progress. There's a civilization that kills multitudes in mass warfare, that pollutes the land and the oceans with even larger quantities of debris, that destroys the dignity of individuals by subjecting them to a forced, mechanized existence, can hardly be called an advance over the simpler hunter-gathering agricultural existence of prehistoric times.